This is an exclusive interview excerpt from What Lies Beyond with Matt Coburn. Conversations on consciousness science, the paranormal, and the post-material future. Visit us and subscribe on whatliesbeyond.substack.com. My first guest on What Lies Beyond is Bethany Butzer, PhD. Bethany writes, teaches and conducts research in the fields of positive psychology and transpersonal psychology. She is currently the Assistant Director of the Aleph Trust PhD Programme in Applied Transpersonal Psychology. We also both teach on the Trust's Approaches to Consciousness short course, which is part of their Master's Programme. In this clip extract, Bethany talks about her educational experiences in psychology and consciousness. We also talk about the current state of play in consciousness studies and how we might reconcile materialist with post-materialist approaches. The full interview will be released on the 3rd of October.
And of course, ended up in psychology, where consciousness, on the one hand, is a major feature of psychology if you think about it. But on the other hand, it's actually not taught very often in either undergraduate or graduate programs. So I think I took one course in consciousness in my undergraduate degree many years ago. And then, for the most part, forgot about it until further along in grad school, where I started to become less and less happy with the mainstream education that I was receiving. I mean, it was a great education. I was taught many wonderful things by many wonderful people, but there was a way in which consciousness and the transpersonal weren't included at all. They were taboo. You weren't allowed to even think about the idea that consciousness might not be part of like something that's generated by the brain, basically. And so what I guess my shorter way of answering this would be that I've had experiences throughout my life that you could classify as paranormal, psi phenomena, synchronicities.
Yeah.
And I felt that my professional life, I often say this, my professional life was gaslighting my personal life, because my professional life was telling me that these things I was experiencing weren't real, they weren't part of science, and needed to be ignored. And it was a growing dissatisfaction with that led me to the Aleph Trust consciousness program, their MSc program, and the course that I ended up taking with you. And so it was a long and winding road, but I eventually got here.
So yes, I remember when you were taking the course, but also when you started teaching the Approaches to Consciousness course, you were actually teaching a mainstream, was it neuroscience course in consciousness? So can you tell me a bit about the difference between the mainstream approaches and what the Aleph Trust, what you found in the Aleph Trust, maybe?
Yeah, I was teaching so I live in Prague, and I was teaching at the University of New York in Prague, which is, it's an American university, but in Prague, very mainstream, but it's a small satellite location. So because it's smaller, they were actually open, a little more open to some of these different types of views. And so I proposed to them that I would teach a course called Mind, Body, Consciousness. And so I developed this course myself. And in that course, I taught about mainstream approaches to consciousness. So a lot of neuroscientific approaches. I taught about psychoneural immunology, the placebo effect, etc. But I also slipped in some classes on parapsychology and transpersonal psychology. And so there wasn't necessarily so much of a difference in my teaching, but there was a difference in the student body and the way that they reacted to that teaching. And so in the mainstream university, I would say the majority of my students were willing to listen to me, but they weren't very as open to these ideas about parapsychology or consciousness beyond the brain. But by the end of the semester, many of them would come to me and say, you know what, I still don't totally buy into what you're saying, but I appreciate this course because you made me think a little bit about some of the underlying assumptions of this mainstream approach that I've been taught in, and I feel like I'm a bit more, I'm a better critical thinker now. And so I always appreciated that. And of course, at Aleph Trust, the students come in much more open to these, what you could call alternative views on consciousness. But at the same time, sometimes they're a little too far in that direction, not being as critical about some of these post-materialist views on consciousness, for example. And so we have to pull them back a little bit and get them critical thinking in the other direction. So it goes both ways, really.
Because with the current status of consciousness studies, we've got an explosion of very neuroscience sort of brain function theories. You know, virtually every week I sort of read an article of some new theory that's been proposed. You know, so I think last week the emergentism has come through again. But it's funny that I quite often that the headline says, you know, might say in a pop science publication, oh, this theory explains consciousness. And then you click on it, and actually, usually the findings of the theory is much more modest. So what's your sense of the current state of play with consciousness studies?
That is a $1 million question in a way, because I was just reading an article earlier this week that created not really an infographic, really just a table of the different materialist and post-materialist consciousness theories that this particular author could find. It was extremely comprehensive. You've probably seen it, but I'll send it to you just in case you haven't. And the sheer number of theories in this table, the font is this big. It's just so many theories. And in some ways, I'm of two minds about this. I guess, I don't know if that pun is intended or not, but I'm of two minds. So on the one hand, I think that a proliferation of theories is a good thing because it shows that there's interest. People are interested. They're coming up with ideas. They're, in some cases, communicating with each other about these ideas. So there's some of these adversarial collaborations, for example, where they sort of pit certain theories against each other and study them. So I think that's all great. There's also a thought process that goes through my mind, and I know it's shared by some others as well, of, things are becoming too muddled, like we're getting too much into the weeds. We're not communicating with each other enough, and we're reinventing the wheel by just coming up with slightly more fine-grained theories. And to be honest, as someone who, you know, as we've talked about, I'm a module leader on this course. In some ways, you might expect me to be an expert on these theories of consciousness, but there is no way that I can know about all of these theories or explain all of them. I know many of them in broad strokes, but there's so many that it almost gets a little bit diluted. And I think that the field in general would benefit from a lot more dialogue between theories, between theoretical perspectives, between people who actually disagree with each other, and dialogue or even debate a little bit, which can really be helpful. I watched a podcast recently which was a long it really was just a conversation between Bernardo Kastrup and Christoph Koch. And they were, I don't know if you've seen this one, but it's almost 2 hours long, where they're just riffing about their various theories. And so, you know, Christoph's theory is integrated information theory. Bernardo's talking about analytic idealism. And what I loved about this podcast is that even though there's several points upon which they perhaps disagree, or, you know, Koch was saying things like, well, I don't get this. Like, what do you mean the entire universe is mental? This makes no sense to me. I want to test this in my laboratory right now. But they were laughing, they were smiling, they were collegial about the discussion. And by the end, they started to come to some potentially testable ideas because they took the time to speak with each other, as opposed to just saying my theory is the best one and shutting out all of the rest of the theories.
Yes, I agree. I think there's a bit of both going on. I mean, I've noticed that, and it does seem to be a feature of sort of mainstream stuff, but also other alternative theories can be exclusive as well. But there is this sense that sometimes that, oh, well, we've got the right theory because it's scientifically testable, whereas the other theory isn't. But at the same time, I think there have been some sort of competitive collaborations, haven't there, recently? So different researchers with these different theories have been getting together and trying to sort of, I was going to say outdo one another, but they've been trying to cooperate, although they still have those perhaps useful differences.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think, in my view, this is what like good science is when people, I think it was maybe Charles Eisenstein who said something about science as being a state of humble not knowing in the face of the great mystery. And I think that that's really the right way to do it. Whereas many scientists believe that they're being scientific and objective by sticking to a certain view, a certain theory, or to specific metaphysical assumptions that they don't even realize they hold.
Yes.
We talk about this often in our course, but materialism, the idea that matter is the fundamental nature of reality and that's it, the end. That's an underlying metaphysical assumption to most of science that very few people ever question or talk about or even are willing to entertain a different idea because it's seen as perhaps sacrilegious in some way. And so this is where science, the science of consciousness included, can start to become really dogmatic and rigid. And that's when I think we start to get into trouble, because the whole point of science, a few hundred years ago, was to get away from the dogmatic aspects of religion, and it's sort of twisted in on itself and in some ways become dogmatic in its own right.
Yes, I mean, probably a bit too much, but I tend to take a both and rather than an either or. So rather than say, we'll accept this body of data or information, but we'll reject that body, I try and say, how do we understand these two perhaps disparate pieces of information together? So I think, it can happen both ways, though, because I've noticed that, some of our students tend to reject neuroscience without really getting to grips with some of the arguments. Mm-hmm. So it's not necessarily sort of mainstream to alternative. It can be the other way around as well. So how do you think we could get over that sort of resistance?
Well, sometimes I'm like you in the sense that I tend to follow this perhaps more of a both and perspective. And sometimes I almost feel like I'm being a politician because I give non-answers. People will say, well, which theory do you like the best? Or, well, what do you think, Bethany? And I'll say, well, I think this and this. And it ends up in a way coming across as a non-answer. But I think we could actually do with a little more non-answers in our scientific pursuits. It's that humility, I think. Part of getting past this standstill of, oh, it's this approach or this approach, is that I think in some ways it can be both.